Good afternoon. This session is one and only session for monitoring technology. So, for opening it, I'm talking about and looking back into the basics of carbon monitoring. So, the last year, agreement on Service 31 in Copenhagen says that COP requires developing countries party to establish robust and permanent and transparent national forest monitoring system, and that use a combination of remote sensing and ground-based forest carbon inventory. That is the start of my presentation. So as you know, carbon stocks can be estimated by a product and forest area and carbon density in each forest types. And forest area is changed by deforestation and also afforestation, deforestation. And these changes are monitored, can be monitored by for remote sensing. So, here, forest area can be monitored by remote sensing. On the other hand, carbon density is changed by forest degradation and also plus activity of REDD+, including conservation and sustainable forest management, enhancement of carbon stocks. These changes can be monitored by repeated ground survey. Default value, no, because default value is fixed. Default value does not show the changes of carbon density. On the other hand, I would like to show the basics of methodology of carbon accounting by IPCC. Well, IPCC good practice guidance and guidelines shows the two main methodology for carbon accounting. So first is the default method in good practice guidance. That name was changed into gain-loss method in guidelines. That idea is very easy. Carbon stocks equal gain by growth, forest growth, minus loss by disturbance. This disturbance includes natural disturbance, just like typhoon, strong wind, fire, insect disease, and also including human-induced disturbance, such as logging, harvesting, thinning, like that. So this methodology is very easy to employ. However, I think estimating loss by disturbance is not easy, because in REDD+ activity, there are many illegal logging there. So estimating illegal logging and the amount is not easy, I think. On the other hand, IPCC showed another methodology for carbon stock change method. The name was changed into stock difference method in 2006 guidelines. The idea is different from the default method. Carbon stock change is the differences of carbon stocks in two repeated estimation, evaluation. This stock change method and give the feasible estimation because we don't need to estimate carbon loss by disturbance. However, on the other hand, stock change method require repeated ground survey, repeated ground measurement. So there are two types of estimation method. For me, my team developed Japan's forest carbon accounting system for the Kyoto Protocol. We employed this methodology, stock change method, because the estimation of loss by disturbance is difficult, even in Japan. So, based on the idea, we tried the carbon stock estimation in Cambodia. The Cambodia had main two species, including evergreen forest and deciduous forest. We measured, we settled permanent sample plots. The number is 155, and we employed allometry equation and parameters for estimation of carbon, biomass carbon. In the result, we estimated this value. So, however, that estimation had a big uncertainty. So we understand a sufficient number of repeated plots are required for REDD plus carbon monitoring. So based on the result, we began to new research for same area, and we are analyzing and satellite images, and we makes more types of forests, and also we will measure same sampling plot. So I mean repeating measurement are going there. The result will be will facilitate to develop Cambodian carbon forest carbon monitoring system. And on the other hand, this methodology anyway require a lot of sampling plot. So on the other hand, national forest inventory, normal national forest inventory consists of a lot of sampling plots. For example, Japan has a monitoring system at 4-kilometer grid, so the number of sampling plots is more than 15,000. So I think carbon monitoring system should be designed based on national forest inventory to use result of plot measurement, and or both should be installed at once because developed countries does not have such national forest inventory system. So this is a very good chance to install the national forest inventory based on grid sampling and systematic sampling methodology. So of course, national forest inventory gives us information not only for carbon, but also for products, environment service, and biodiversity. So this is my presentation, and this is opening of this session.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to provide an update on the activities of GOFC-GOLD as one of the co-hosts of the event, so thank you very much for the invitation, also from FFPRI. GOFC-GOLD stands for Global Observation of Forest Cover and Land Dynamics. It's a terrestrial observing system, global terrestrial observing system panel. And we've been working on supporting REDD Plus since 2005 through a dedicated expert working group. And to start off, I would also always like to show this slide, which basically shows the capacity gap that countries currently have in monitoring their forests nationally. So basically, as darker brown the color is, as larger the capacity gap, it's relative to the different country cases. So it not only shows that there is, as everybody knows, quite a challenge to build capacities in developing countries so they are able to monitor and report for any REDD Plus regime. But also there's quite a variability of different capacities in different countries, and as we also see the negotiations go, that there probably not one solution. Each country will have a bit of a different solution for their specific national circumstances, REDD opportunities, development pathways, and so on, that will all be needing to be reflected then in the monitoring system. So as one of the activities to help to fill these gaps, and also to recognize that actually Earth observation and remote sensing will probably play a more important role in this capacity building than it has played in forest monitoring on national level in the past. GOFC-GOLD has issued a source book, which, let me try to go back, here we go, that is now the 5th revision available, became available 2 days ago. The website is listed below. And it's a source book of methods and procedures for monitoring, reporting anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions for REDD Plus. And it's consensus perspective from a series of key experts in that field, and they're basically listed here. So it's quite a large number of authors that have contributed, and would also like to acknowledge a few sponsors that have supported the coordination of that activity. I'd also like to give you a bit of an update on what is new in the source book. First of all, this is the overview of the current outline. It's quite small, I understand that, but there's an introductory section, a methodological section, an examples section where we actually look at practical examples for data collection, and one on country capacity building. And I'd just not like to go through that in all detail, I'd just like to point out the most important things that we have been working on over the last year to update the version that we presented at COP in Copenhagen. First of all, and that was already mentioned, there was actually a subset decision in Copenhagen on REDD Plus on the methodological issues, and there are some clear guidance that we built our update based on that guidance coming from the political level. There further were a number of important meetings. In fact, there was an IPCC LULUCF expert panel meeting in March last year, who looked into not only REDD but forest inventories in the LULUCF component in general. Substa had a capacity building coordination workshop to help countries to better implement the IPCC good practice guidelines, and we actually had our own workshop where we brought a lot of experts together to update the source book as it is right now. So the most important things, first of all, we further strengthened the link to the IPCC good practice guidelines. We had actually IPCC reviewers that review Kyoto greenhouse gas inventories today to look through the sections and really strengthen that link, and we'll see that particularly reflected now in the introductory section. We added a fair amount of material on what is related to REDD Plus, so it's not only about deforestation but also things related to deforestation, reforestation, for example. We also included a section now on some of the emerging issues that are coming up. So it's not only about deforestation, we see things coming up like monitoring of activities and drivers and some of these things. And we'll have some initial thinking with respect to that. A little bit on safeguards, not so much, but also on starting to think about linking national and subnational monitoring to support local implementation. And since a fair amount of experts working on the source book are actually remote sensing experts, we actually have a section on evolving technologies. As you know, and you just can have a look upstairs at some of the booths that are available, the remote sensing community is working to further improve the value of Earth observation, satellite data, and all there are some challenges associated with that to make them even more useful for countries and for country capacity building. So new technologies, and this is particularly in the section of the evolving technologies that has been updated there. So if you're also interested in that, there's a booth of the Group on Earth Observation GEO upstairs, for example, and you'll probably see the event of Google that is on the agenda later today. Thank you very much.
What I would like to present, short, we only have 5 minutes, is how we in Mexico we try to tackle the challenge for customizing MRV from national to local scale. I don't know if the slides. This is an effort that we're trying to work with various institutes. We are collaborating with the government, CIFOR, also with the Research Institute and various NGOs that will help us set up the system. I don't have the slides, so one of the main questions that we would like to tackle in our system is how can we go from a national scale commitment, let's say, of our reductions of emissions, to a local scale where the actions will take place. So, as many countries, Mexico is a country that has a high variety of forest ecosystems. All these systems are variably influenced by human impact. It's also characterized by a very fragmented land tenure system. So most of the forests in Mexico have owners, either community or other organizations or privately owned. So 90% of the forest has an owner. So if any REDD implementation has to deal with these owners. So we have to, let's say this is just a graph, let's say this is a national goal, let's say a commitment that looks nice in a nice line, but if we look at a local scale, we get various fluxes going on in the various communities, depending on how they are organized and depending on how they're using the soil. So how can we develop a monitoring system that can cope with these kind of questions, scaling questions? The next, and the one. So this is let's say this an implementation strategy that we are trying to develop. It's based on the National Forest Inventory that Mexico is fortunate to have a National Forest Inventory established since 2004, in which they have about 25,000 permanent plots established between 2004 and 2007, and they were measuring every 20% every year with very intensive measurements, very costly, and they measure all 5 pools with all the traditional forest methodology. There's also various states that have developed a state forest inventory that in some cases it's based on the national forestry, in other cases they have been developed independently. And what we're trying to organize now is a kind of a community-based monitoring system that's related to the other systems in such a way that the information that they collect on the local scale can be scaled up and scaled down to the forest inventory. So they use, let's say, I don't think I have a pointer here. So let's say they have various points in which, for example, they have a lot of points where they only collect key variables like basal area or other factors related to more traditional national inventory points, and then organized, let's say the communities are organized through various mechanisms of organization, like, for example, NGOs that are working in those community structures, like in those maps. So we can get a system that can be scaled up from the community to the national, and from the national to the communities, in such a way that we can, if REDD is going to work, we can see which communities are contributing to REDD, especially if we also connect the information that's collecting on the ground in such a way that it can be scaled up also to remote sensing, which is one of the key issues that we have to resolve. So this is my main message that I want to present. 5 minutes I have. Thank you.
I'm glad to be here. I very much appreciate the organizers to invite me to share our national experiences on what we are doing in Tanzania. Actually, when I was sitting up there, I was feeling a bit warmer. But when I came up here, and there is a big jet stream of cold, I had to ask my colleague from Sweden to sit on my chair there. But that is part of our climate change. Tanzania is actually implementing a project on the National Forest Resources Monitoring and Assessment. We are doing a multi-purpose project. I had made 15 slides. But in the interest of 5 minutes, it will be like a joke to talk with those slides. Therefore, you'll excuse me, I will talk from not following the slides. But what I'm saying, we needed a multi-purpose national inventory. We are going beyond what is conventional under the FAO system. Ours is combining with the emerging issues, putting the carbon stocks and considering what people are saying, what we are doing on forestry. Therefore, the measurements are done on trees, but also some of the plots are taking carbon, and others, then they are doing the socio-economic aspect. We have a deforestation rate of about 500,000 hectares per year. This has been in record, but we are not sure whether it is in that form, and we hope to establish a new deforestation rate once the project is ready. We have very unsustainable data. We needed to come up with very reliable information which will help us in our planning processes, which will help us to put up new policies and be able to make sustainable forest management plans, but also to engage the stakeholders in the process. We are looking forward by 2012 to be able to complete the process. We started late, early 2009, but basically it has taken longer to agree on the methodology because it is a new undertaking. And now we have covered almost 30% of the regions in Tanzania. And as we are measuring, it is in the forest and the trees outside the forest, and as I have already indicated, taking the socio-economic aspect into consideration. Basically, we want to have a system of data management that will take us into a foreseeable future where we can be able to track the changes, if it is carbon or what is happening in the forests themselves. And we can measure even the conditions as far as human activities are concerned. We are going to have about 3,400 sample plots, which would basically cover the biophysical characteristics, including the soils as well as measuring the trees themselves. We are also going to have about 5,000 interviews with the people where the plots would be foreign, either even in the urban or in the villages, but we want to know what is happening and what people are saying about the trees, about the forest, about climate change, so that we have a consolidated pathway to be able to plan our activities. What are the limitations so far? We are getting to understand that part of these processes, they need very specialized techniques. You need a special expertise, which we are lacking. And issues like remote sensing, they are very technical. Our department doesn't have that specialized skills, but in the process, we hope to build that capacity. We talk of MRVs, monitoring, reporting, and assessment. These are coming issues in the light of climate change. They are not new in a way, but when it comes to put things on the ground, then you need to follow as by IPCC guidelines. You need to come up with a program which will be accepted globally. It is taking time, and these are the part of the shortcomings. We have few people in the department, as I've already indicated, remote sensing, but we need to put up a database that will be rigorous and can be able to retrieve and store the information. We hope to have a more collaborative with the other sectors, the non-forestry sectors in the country. And these are the ones, in one or another, impacting on our forest resources, agriculture. You know, a sustainable agricultural system, you get to lose the land productivity, and then it fuels people to go to the forestry and then disturb the ecosystems. So we hope under our system to be able to move. But we have to look into systems how we can reduce these barriers. And one is to work very closely with the universities and the other technical institutions like FAO, as we are working together, and be able to train our staff and manage our resources in a way which is well articulated. Under UNREDD, our focus is to build the capacity, and our National Forest Resources and Assessment is linking very closely with UNREDD in order to come up with a workable and acceptable training package for the people. We are also engaging the local communities. People are being trained on how to measure the trees and how to keep the data and how they can follow up in the field. It is a matter of a process. And when we are operating with the people, they expect some tangible benefits sooner or later. So that is again a challenge, and we don't know when we should start rewarding or making some incentives to the people. We are hoping that part of the lessons learned are as follows. Inadequate planning bogged down our system. We had anticipated to start in January 2009, but we started in March this year. And the process has taken a bit longer because of agreeing on the methodology, but also on the financing. If we were to work on the forest as forestry, our original budget was to be $3 million US. But getting beyond the forestry boundaries, we needed about $6 million US. So it took time to be able to gather and be able to start the activities, linking with the local initiatives and also getting for the people to understand, to engage the stakeholders to understand the project. It took a bit time. I know my time is getting closer, but we are hoping that as we go, the major gaps which are existing should be a little bit reduced, and we hope that by working under the process as we are engaged in the World Bank and the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility under the UN REDD, but also collaborating with the local institutions within the country, we should minimize these gaps. And we are looking forward to having a robust data information system that will be a basis for future monitoring, and we can track the changes. We shall put in place sooner or later the baseline scenarios so that Tanzania becomes one of the implementing activities under REDD and be able to contain what is happening within the climate change cycles. Chair, I think I end up here. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
From here you can actually see the audience, from there it's impossible. So, hello. Reducing to 3 slides in 5 minutes means that you have to reduce the font size considerably and speak much faster. So I'll try to do the best of the time I have. And I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit from the more detailed advances on MRV that we heard about before, and relate to a discussion that we are having on a monitoring framework for REDD+. And we've discussed for a long time that it's not only about carbon, but then what is it about? And we see a need to actually develop those thoughts a little bit. Not directly and immediately in relation to the negotiated text, but more looking at the needs for implementation of REDD. So, what are the monitoring requirements? And here we need to consider what do we mean by REDD+. And one starting point I have is that the REDD+ context is divided into 3 categories. It's the carbon, which is the mitigation actions. It's the environment, which is part of the safeguards, which is the wider range of ecosystem services and products from forests, multiple benefits, and it includes environmental safeguards. And then it's the governance and social safeguards, which is part of the, obviously the safeguards part of REDD. And all of these also relate to the principles of REDD+, in which it says that REDD+ must be in harmony with overall development efforts. So there is a broader picture in there. So 3 information categories: carbon, the results of emission activities; the environment, could have other names; and then governance and social safeguards. Then we have another dimension that we try to illustrate in this way, that there are different levels and purposes of the monitoring that we want to apply to be able to implement REDD. One is what we can call a strategic level, and the other is an operational level. A strategic level is what we usually talk about when we hear MRV, because MRV is tied to the national reporting and the capacity to generate information and verify it, and also to generate information that help national policy processes and maybe to comply with other international commitments, not just the ones in this particular convention. So that's the strategic level, very focused on the national level. The operational level is different. It's mainly to serve the needs of implementation on the ground. That is, assuring and maybe enforcing, depending on how the policies are constructed, at the local project or program scale. And if you look at these two levels, and I'm now also going back to forestry planning theory and practice, the information requirements are actually quite different between these two levels. And at the strategic level, you need accuracy, precision, and you need to know the quality of the information, and there's a long history of science into that. At the operational level, you actually don't need the same depth of information, because usually you would work with some form of proxies to implement your policies on the ground. But on the other hand, you would work on all land, meaning that, for example, remote sensing technologies would be quite valuable, because that's an economic way of covering all land. So 2 dimensions, and if we put them together, it becomes a matrix, a 2x3, so 2x4 actually, matrix. The strategic and operational level, and then the carbon, the environment, the social safeguards, and the governance are split it in 2 at the bottom. And maybe this is an embryo of what we could call a REDD Plus monitoring framework. It will not be a framework that gives us all the details of the operational tools. We've heard already about some of these operational tools, and I'm sure Sandra will say more about those. But this will be more a description of what's the context, what do we mean, what is it that we need to monitor, and what are the key considerations that we need to look into to make that monitoring happen, so as to create a common platform. And then I'll not go into detail, but then you can fairly straightforwardly apply different pieces of what we monitor into these cells of the matrix. The top left one is easy, that's the greenhouse gas inventories. In the environment cells, of course, you have at the strategic level biodiversity issues, wood and non-wood products. At the national level, issues related to displacement. And at the operational level, it's more about land use planning, conservation, and possibly reversals of the actions taken. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm only suggesting that there is a need to do some groundwork to have a simpler way to explain what we mean by a monitoring framework. We actually had an expert consultation on land tenure and climate change mitigation some weeks ago. And we talked about this monitoring framework also in that context. And we talked about it in another meeting where we talked about monitoring governance. And in both of these, it came up that, but if we monitor these things, should we include finance? Shouldn't finance be part of the monitoring framework? And maybe it should. It's just that that's a new entry into discussion, so I haven't entered it in this slide. So, oops, oh, too fast. So then, if we look at operational tools, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, there will be a number of different tools that we can use to achieve the monitoring that we have identified. And I'm just going to list 3 very broad, and without going into detail. National forest inventories is obviously one tool. It's not the tool, but it's one tool. And with adjustments to the methodologies applied for a very long time, and with an organized mix of field data, remote sensing, and a variety of models, you actually can do quite a lot of the monitoring that we need. At the operational level, I mentioned that remote sensing would be very suitable because you can cover all down in an economic way. And then at the bottom of the matrix, we will need to have different forms of governance monitoring systems, which I will not go into detail on now. So, ongoing work in the UN REDD program that relates to monitoring. Of course, we're doing a lot on MRV of carbon. We heard some examples by Felicien just now. We do that in many other countries than at the global level. I mentioned that we're working on monitoring of governance safeguards through so far a consultation process. We're working with country-led governance assessments related to the governance needs. We're working with multiple benefits, which relates to the environment aspects of REDD+, and including the environment safeguards. We're working with social and environmental standards, and also with investments and sector transformation. All of these have monitoring needs in REDD+, so this is very much beyond the carbon. That's it. So I hope that I've sold the idea that we need a monitoring framework that can be used to help us all understand and have a common starting point for what we need to make REDD Plus work. Because we hear more and more saying that there will be a REDD on Friday. We'll see. Thank you.
Well, I took a slightly different tack than the previous speakers. If you look at the description of this section, it talks about addressing 3 questions. So in my simple way of thinking, I thought, well, let me make a key point about each of the questions based on the experiences and work that I do at Winrock. So the first question was to do with inventories. May I have the slides? So, is there a use of national forest inventories? We've heard quite a bit in the last half hour. We have that we need a national forest inventory. Maybe Peter was even going further and talking about their use at different levels, strategic. Once again, I just kind of think in somewhat practical terms based on experiences that we are facing with the work we do with various countries. So I guess the argument I have about a national forest inventory is typically we have thought about a national forest inventory, you know, putting lots of plots in the ground, coming up with volume equations and estimating the timber stock. That was traditionally the way it was done, at least in the United States and Europe, I'm sure. You know, we've had changes through time, and you find that if you start to look at what's been done in tropical countries in particular, there are very few national forest inventories. So, you know, the thought of putting in place an expense today of a national forest inventory that's going to address REDD. So I'm just talking about REDD now. Let's just think about REDD. There's a lot of work to be done in getting the emission factors for dealing with REDD. Do we need a national forest inventory? And I guess my argument is it depends. If you have a country perhaps like Mexico, which is a very fragmented landscape, maybe it makes sense to have a national forest inventory because, you know, a lot of the forests are under threat. But if you go to other parts of the world and other developing countries, there are parts of the forest estate, shall we say, that are not at risk for deforestation or degradation. And we have to think about identifying the risk. And even your president in Mexico this morning talked about looking at the risk or the threat to the forest. And there are simple tools available these days. There are a variety of these simple tools, spatial analysis, looking at explanatory factors based on past patterns of deforestation on the landscape to generate areas that are under risk for further deforestation and areas that are under very limited risk. Therefore, in the time of limited resources, we need to think about strategically inventorying the forest for emission factors to go with the activity data, the data from remote sensing, and maybe we can do that by looking at ways we can assess risk to further degradation and deforestation and go from there. So that's my first point about the relationship between MRV and, in the first question, and national forest inventories. Okay, the second question asked about experiences and capacity. Am I doing? For capacity building. Now, obviously, you saw the map that Martin put up, and he had a map that had various shades of browns and yellows indicating the degree of capacity. And many of us sit in this room, we understand that there are a variety of capacity needs around the world. It's just that, you know, one of the benefits of some of the Western countries is they have what I call bench strength, meaning depth. You don't have just one layer of experts, but you have several layers of experts. And of course, that's a key issue in capacity building. Not only do you then build the depth, but you have more sustainable capacity. So we've done quite a bit of capacity building, and there's a lot could be said here, and I could go on for another 5 or 10 minutes talk about capacity building. But the point is, you know, different countries have needs that are different. So obviously a clear place that we have found from experience where we've done work both in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, you talk about, you know, doing like a needs assessment. What needs do you have? What are missing? And then you can start tailoring capacity building programs. But one of the common elements of all the work that we have looked at is the need for straightforward, simple manuals and methods, tools giving standardized approaches to particularly doing the field component to measure carbon stocks. Not only how to measure, how to analyze, and how to put this together as combine it with the remote sensing data. And we have developed, in the course of our work, a variety of tools to help us. But the point is, when you develop such tools and train people on these tools and manuals, you can start to have more confidence that you're applying these methods more consistently and effectively. The last, could someone just, I don't know what my technology today is not, but my last slide is about technology advances. Could someone advance the slide? I'm having a problem here. The technology, simple technology is not working for me, and I'm proposing more advanced technology. Okay, so what are some of the gaps? Well, we could sit here and discuss, what are the gaps in our knowledge? Some of it's just really testing out some techniques, and what I'm proposing here, that what we need is to test some of these, test at demonstration sites, some of these promising new technologies that are coming along. I think, the advantage of kind of designing a REDD in today's world, a REDD monitoring program in today's world, is that we have a long history of measuring in forests, and we have now all this new technology coming out. LiDAR you hear about, Google Earth, some of you, Earth Engine, radar, all kinds of fascinating new technologies. And the question is, are these at the stage of being implemented? Are they ready to go? Or is there still some further testing just to kind of make sure that we're happy with? We know that we can measure trees, do an inventory on the ground, and we know what we're doing, and we know we're going to get the right results. So I propose that we just need to kind of do a little bit more testing of these promising emerging methods to monitor emissions from what I call degradation. I mean, we can do deforestation. There's no problem in monitoring deforestation, both from space and from the ground data. That's not the issue. But as many of us know, degradation is a little bit more challenging. And what do we mean by degradation? Well, I'm talking about two specific activities here. Basically, removal of timber, removal of trees, for timber or for fuel. And there are some interesting things. So very quickly, you can look at the first one at the extreme left hand. There's this LiDAR. LiDAR can basically start to now, with a combination of calibrating the LiDAR images, airborne platforms, do fairly extensive coverage, and equate this to carbon stocks. And so you can imagine a carbon stock at year 1, you go back and you can do the carbon stock at time 2 from the air, not on the ground after you've calibrated that data. Or we could perhaps decide, well, can't afford a full coverage of LiDAR because it's not cheap yet. So obviously there's a cost issue. You could perhaps do some high-resolution aerial imagery, and you can collect that at like the 10-20 centimeter range. And there are techniques out there now that you can look at this aerial imagery. In the old days, it would be a stereo viewer on the images. Now you can do this all on a computer and change the resolution, and you can see this in stereo and take measurements on the trees right there on your computer. That's the middle slide. Or, we need to think about some of these, particularly for timber extraction, with similar forest types. Like imagine Central Africa. You've got a region there with the Central African countries. The impact of logging, I argue, would be fairly similar in terms of the damage per amount of timber extract. So we need to think about developing perhaps some regional emission factors so that we don't have to keep repeating things. And so we could look at some regional emission factors, get people working together, sharing information. And I guess those are the only 3 points we're going to make, and we're now at the end of this first part of presentations, and I'm sure Dr. Masahiro will be taking over from the next phase. Thank you.
Doug Boucher from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I have a question for Dr. Brown. the stratification of inventories, so you focus on the high deforestation areas. What countries do you think that would be most useful for? For example, it seems to me that high forest, low deforestation countries would be particularly valuable in using resources if you concentrate on the relatively small areas where deforestation is taking place.
Hi, I'm Ken Andraska from the World Bank and the FCPF program. I guess my question would be about degradation. So Sandra mentioned 3 potential approaches, and the question is, how much progress are we making on trying to compare the potential for operational techniques for addressing degradation? Can you give us any examples of places where several of the techniques have been compared and assessed in terms of how feasible they are? And what's the next step to get something going relatively rapidly for all the countries interested in trying to address degradation? Thank you.
Is there any other question? Okay, please.
Martin Tröder, KfW Carbon Fund. I have a question for Peter in regard to the monitoring framework. When I think of REDD Plus, the REDD Plus always scares me somehow a little bit, because the plus also means that the efforts, of course, are increasing substantially, and if you're asking for a whole lot more, you might end up with getting nothing when it comes to actually implementing a very sophisticated monitoring framework. So the question would be, do you think there's easy answers to certain fields within that monitoring framework? Like, for example, thinking of no harm aspects.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, 2 questions for Sandra, please.
Okay, a question about stratifying by risk. I mean, that's basically what I was driving at, is these high, countries with high forest cover, and you can kind of, shall we say, low deforestation, like Guyana. That was one of the countries we had up there. Obviously, some of you might recognize the outline. That was an example, was Guyana. You know, but you can, I think that would be the prime countries to do them in, many of the Central African countries that have, you know, fairly high, they have high forest cover, low deforestation, and some of the other example up there was actually East Kalimantan in Indonesia. But, you know, don't get me wrong about, you know, national forest inventories. I like them, and there's a lot of good information to come out of it, but, you know, when you're dealing with resources, a limited amount of resources, and we're trying to go for many developing countries, and particularly in the tropics, who have either just a few regional inventories that are very old by now, and there's some of them are in the planning stage of putting national inventories in. Let's just do some things for REDD, if that's where the country's interested, and let's get that design done. And the benefit is that you can set your targets at a reasonable, acceptable precision level and still get away with a reasonable effort of number plots. So that's why it's good to think about stratifying by risk. So that answers that question. The other one about new techniques for degradation from Ken Andrasko. You know, the good question, Ken, and I've been kind of pushing, that's what I'd like to see. You know, let's just test these 3 methods out. And it's not just, you know, do they give the same answers, but it's got things like ease, cost, effectiveness, and, you know, does it give you kind of, is it suitable for doing through time? And, you know, we've done a little bit of a couple of them. We've done the field methods, a lot of the field stuff, option 3 on my slide. We've done a little bit of the option 2 with the high resolution aerial imagery. What we haven't had the advantage of testing with is, you know, with the LiDAR. So you can imagine a study to do this. You know, you kind of get it done in the different key regions, and you can just get those 3 data sets collected, ground, mid-level LiDAR. You know, probably cost of, you know, a few $100,000, maybe a bit more than that, probably. But the point is, I agree with you, it's something that has to be tested, and I think, you know, it's poised, the technologies are there, it's just a question of getting them operationalized out in the regions to get something done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Peter, please.
That there is a national institution of some sort that comes up with reliable and verifiable and transparent and robust reports on mitigation actions. And the way to get that information is to a very large extent through a national forest inventory. Then we can start discussing how that looks like. How do you design the plots? How do you stratify? How much do you use remote sensing? How many volume functions do we need to, or expansion functions do we need to develop, etc. That's the technical bit of it. But from a kind of implicit definition point of view, you need that institution. So I think it's partly semantics what we're talking about. And then on degradation, I would also like to mention that if you have an NFI and if you accept what Sandra said, that degradation can be measured as a change in carbon stock. I think you said that roughly. Yeah, well, whatever. But if it has to do with the carbon stock between over time, then actually you can do it. Do we bring too many things into this? This is a key question. Again, I think exactly for the reason not to start a variety of monitoring initiatives and institutions and so on. That's why we need to have a framework to explain what is the requirement as a starting point. And then based on that, we can start figuring out, okay, so what's the smartest way of doing this in this particular country? Maybe it is a country where you can be very smart in your design and you can come away with a very focused and small number of field plots. In other cases, maybe the governance issues are already solved through another sector, so you may not have to focus on that for that specifically. So, but I need, the framework as such doesn't add. The framework gives us a possibility to design. And all, this is mainly a communication tool. And then I think there's a difference of philosophy here that is important. I wouldn't say it's a difference of opinion, but it is an issue for discussion. And again, I think it should be brought down to the country level. Do we have the philosophy that REDD monitoring is a standalone feature to meet the needs of the REDD agreement? That's quite possible, and I don't have any dogs in this fight. So that's one way of doing it. Or is it a situation where the needs for REDD monitoring overlap and have synergies with needs of monitoring for other things? In that case, maybe it would be smart to combine the monitoring efforts so as to make best use of the available resources. Which is what they're doing, what you're doing in Tanzania, for example. I'm not saying there is a one-size-fits-all. I'm just saying that this is two different philosophies that need to be debated when you implement this. I'll stop, I think.
Yeah, degradation is one of the very big issues in the MRV. So we ask other panelists if you want some of the opinion. Okay, Martin, please.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor. On the degradation issue, the degradation is always a bit of a tricky one because it can mean all different types of activities that cause degradation or loss of carbon stocks in the forest. And it's always not so easy to say, well, we're going to use this technology now and then we're going to have the degradation problem solved. There will be different solutions for different types of changes. And some you cannot do with remote sensing at all, some you can benefit quite well from. So it's really up to the country's circumstances what kind of degradation process are ongoing to really start to think about effective ways to do that. We also have to be careful not to, well, there are different types of gaps, or capacity gaps, right? Many countries have a data gap, many countries have a capacity gap in terms of human resources, in terms of institutional things, in terms of technical resources and so on. There's also a technological gap, but that's a bit of a different one. That many countries are concerned with, and I just recalled a talk from our colleague from Tanzania, where really we talk about very fundamental things, right? And that's why I think we should, if we talk about new technologies and evolving technologies, which are obviously promising, we have to realize there's a really, let's say, more research activities that should be done. I'm in full agreement with that, but we cannot say today that we can, let's say, this will solve our problem in terms of efficient monitoring. So as a remote sensing professor, I say, cool, but in terms of a REDD plus and countries, which is very much a capacity development exercise, we have to be a bit careful.
Yeah, thank you much. Is there any other comment on this matter? Okay, we have another, we would like to get another question from Flora. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Lou Versho from CIFOR. This question is for, I guess, Martin or for Sandra. I'd just like to get your feeling on how much the plus part of REDD Plus complicates the MRV system, and the fact that we now have to measure sinks against a baseline and emissions against the reference emissions level. And are there practical ways that are coming out in these guidelines in the new GOFC-GOLD guidance or the new procedures that Sandra, you're working with to try and integrate sinks and avoided emissions?
You Pastor.
So, thanks for the question. I can talk on behalf of the GOFC-GOLD sourcebook. What we try to do is exactly to think a bit about how the REDD Plus part comes into game. But if you think about it from the IPCC good practice guidelines, it is actually not much more complicated, because you have changes in between land categories, forest to non-forest land and non-forest land to forest, which is then reforestation, and you have changes which are forests remaining as forests. And so the deforestation is probably the most easy part. For reforestation, from the remote sensing side, it's a bit more complicated because you probably usually takes a few years until you can actually see from space the forest really. So it's really the time series kind of signal. It's a bit more complicated, but I think things can be done there as well. The particular challenge is really on the remaining forest side, which basically a lot of the things that I've talked about, sustainable forest management, degradation, or even increase of forest carbon stocks, that has puts a lot of heavy weight on the ground monitoring side of things. And just if I may, because I forget to do it, I have CDs of the source book with me. They are, please, it's online. You can find it for everybody who can easily download it. They're really for the developing country people. So please see me after this event is ended if you would like to go.
Sandra, do you have anything to add his answer? Okay, Peter, please.
Thanks. I really like this question, because it is much easier on the plus part than on the first D part. It is much easier to measure, report, and verify the mitigation actions, or the mitigation actions for example, forest degradation, than it is to estimate the results, the mitigation actions for deforestation. I won't go into detail now, but it is measurable. Deforestation actually is easy to see, but it's not so easy to validate and verify and then figure out how much carbon that meant, etc. So that's the technical part. The other is a more of a political part to answer this question. Why do you ask? I mean, here we are adding a plus which adds an enormous opportunity of mitigation of climate change. Just look at Africa. How much does the plus add in terms of opportunities for mitigation and opportunities for income for the African countries in the types of landscapes that they have? I must say don't take any offense, but sometimes I find this to be an inappropriate question. It suggests that we should perhaps forget about the plus because it's so difficult to monitor.
Well, I must admit, Peter, I'm not quite sure exactly where you're driving there, but I'll go to So Martin, just to confirm what Martin said, I mean, that's the way, at least the group, Martin's part of that, the kind of the GOFC-GOLD team, think about these processes. You know, you think about it in terms of monitoring forests, remaining forests, and then, you know, changing to another land use. And I mean, I just basically, you know, with a combination of ground, I mean, you have to look at, you can't just lump the degradation into one. And it's just like on the other side, the enhancement, you can, you know, stocks and forests can be enhanced several ways. You can't just have one kind of size fits all, I think. Though, long-term plots, if you can maintain them well and go back and visit them on a regular basis and keep the records well, do have their value, because, you know, if you do it properly, you can track how the changes in carbon would go, whether it be loss or gain. So that's all I just need to add to what was said by the previous two speakers.
Are there any questions? Oh, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine Trainer from the Peace Box Foundation in South Africa. I have a question. Imagine if you, in a country which has a national level REDD MRV framework, if you implement an intervention, for example, which covers 5% of the country, how do you assess the success of that implementation? Do you use the existing NFI framework, or do you add your own methodology to that? I'd like some clarification on how you can see these systems meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Is that what you do on the subnational level is could be calibrated with the national data, so that the information can be collected more efficiently. What we also try to develop is collect those data that could also relate directly to remote sensing. Foresters usually look at the forest from a different perspective as the satellite, so it's very difficult sometimes to relate the data that are collected on the ground to satellite imagery. So we try to develop a system that can help, let's say, that collect data that are useful to estimate biomass, but also collect data that are useful to relate the information that are on the ground to satellite information. So the biomass parameters are correlated with the National Forest Inventory, where there's a lot of information collected very intensively that can be used to calibrate the, let's say, the rapid appraisal. But then we also collect data that from forest structure, forest disturbances that have occurred that could directly be related to satellite imagery, so we can calibrate or validate the satellite imagery. I think one issue is how can we, if we need to reporting on the 5 activities separately, that will be a key issue. How do we separate forest degradation from forest stock enhancement or from sustainable forest management? I think that will be an issue if they have to be reported separately, also spatially, where many things can happen at the same time. That will be a tricky question, I think, for monitoring.
Okay, Sandra, please. Oh, Peter. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think I'd like to second very much what you said, because you described also what I see as the distinction between the strategic national level and the operational level, which is much smaller and where you can't afford the same overhead of measurement. But then, of course, you need to establish the relationship between these two so that you pay for the right things, so to speak. And that's exactly what I also aim at when I describe this distinction. I don't know how much, I have an analogy to make here that in my country for 100 years ago, this is Sweden, a policy was devised that we need to increase our forest productivity. So, because we needed timber for the industry basically, but that's a different story. But what happened was that at the national level, since then, the productivity of the forest has been measured through a national forest inventory. And we've seen an increase in the productivity from about 30 million cubic meters per year to almost 100 million cubic meters per year. So it's a great success in terms of policy at the national level. But the important point is that we haven't been running around and measuring the productivity at every forest landowner's property. Instead, we've devised proxies that we think are useful to drive the development of forestry in the right direction. So we didn't measure at that level. That's the operational level. There we have proxies about which species, how to thin, when to harvest, etc. It's just an analogy, but it illustrates the same type of economics of measurement that I think we need to see in the REDD Plus implementation as well.
Sandra, please.
Just one comment along the same line. I mean, that's another reason why I like to think about stratifying by risk to where you might want to put in plots, because if you're stratified by risk, that's obviously the place to do your interventions, so it helps you identify where to do interventions that are likely to have a reasonable impact. And then, of course, if you have stratified by that and designed your plot layout and collected your data according to kind of a high risk, low risk, medium risk, and number of density of plots and things, and measurements you take and what have you, then you should have a number that would be what you might consider the carbon stock densities of the forest in your project area would be valid to use for your area. So that's just another way to kind of think about it.
Yes, and I think that's what was interesting to see actually from several presentations today. Peter made the idea of the strategic and the operational level center with the kind of subnational stratification, where also Ben alluded to. I mean, I think that's where we actually would be good to put a bit more thinking in, because if you look at not only what Sweden is doing, but also what Kyoto countries are doing to work with landowners to improve LULUCF performance, there's a set of very good examples where you see how a national monitoring system can very much actually help subnational implementation. Everybody who's worked on REDD projects and developed REDD projects knows how complicated the monitoring part is for that. And the idea is really, if you have a good national system, there can be a lot of synergies to be built to make life at the subnational implementation much, much easier and much, much more efficient.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we don't have so much time, so if someone want to say something for us, I would like to accept. Okay. Okay.
I apologize. They, asked whether I was going to make a final statement. I guess I really have nothing to add to what's been said. I mean, you can hear from the debate between the panel here that there are different ideas and different perspectives on how these might be tackled. I think, obviously, you'll come to your own conclusion. These will be national decisions, sovereign decisions, but within some sort of guidance that will come out. I mean, some simple guidance that Martin mentioned, Matsuo in his presentation, what the kind of the subster and the coming out there of the kind of language they're looking for, but how that's translated into your national needs is a different matter. And, and we're just providing different ideas, different perspectives. One thing I often say is, I'm not a forester, I'm an ecologist, and I will admit that up front, but most of my forestry type experiences come from tropical forests. And, I'm always amazed, they're so different, and many of you in the developing countries concerned with REDD are dealing with those kinds of forests. And I sometimes do remind my colleagues from the temperate zone that things are a little bit different down in the tropics and where we have been, where forests are all managed on the landscape pretty well. I live in the United States. We've got plots up the gazoo. Not saying that they necessarily always give us the best data. I'm sorry if there's someone in the US Forest Service might be sitting here. But you know, there are issues, and they change the design through time. So there are issues. So we have to take this into consideration. So that would be my final comment. And Peter, you have no way to rebut me.
Thank you. Anyone? Peter, please.
I was just going to say that of the countries that recently have been involved in discussing various forms of national forest inventories include Brazil, DRC, and Indonesia.
Yeah, I suppose maybe a negotiator, they are thinking about REDD is a very universal concept, but actually there are many different circumstances on each country. Also the measuring approach also are very different. So we have to consider about how to resolve such a gap and between differences. So today, through today's discussions, maybe also the one of the important things is the capacity building for the implementation of the MRV is also very important. If on the other hand, people are more concerned about the finance and not so much the MRV is so different and so different situations in the country by countries. I would like to close, before I close this program, there is some announcement from Forestry and Forest Research Institute.
Thank you for coming and thank you for discussion here. I would like to announce the next discussion. The FFPRI I will hold the International Technical Seminar on REDD+. In Tokyo. In Tokyo coming February. So in the technical seminar, we will have international information exchanges from practices and experience. And so there many country people will attend the discussion. So if you are interested in the seminar, please contact us and please contact the booth of FFPRI. There is a brochure for the next seminar. Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to close this program. On behalf of the FAO and the FFPRI, I thank you all for attending these meetings. And the final message is there is only a 5 minutes break, and the next running event will start immediately. Okay, thank you very much.